And I think I'm going to be repeating some things that I've already said before, but you can just discount them if I do. I'd like to make one clarification, and that is this. After the death of Armida Borelli in 1952, Orsolina Montevecchi, who was her vice president, took over until there was an assembly. At the time that that assembly was held, Maria Stico was elected president. She served for only one term at the request of the Holy Father, at Pius XII. Now, he told her that anybody could be a president, but there were very few, if any, Christian writers in Italy, and since she wrote well, she was to continue her Christian writing, that was more important than being president. This in a very compact wait, I don't Weiss. And she was very, very interested in how we live. I think one of the touching moments when Maria Stico said that she would not be available for re-election was followed by the election at which time Alda Micheli was elected our president and began her first term of office. It was a very beautiful thing to see Maria Stico take Alda by the hand and walk her down the hall to Father Gemelli's quarters and let the two of them have their first talk together under her presidency. Alda was a very interesting woman, but was not too well known at that time. However, she remained our president for almost 22 years, and this was because, not only because we really appreciated her abilities, but because, according to our constitutions, which were under revision at several times during that period, each time there was a revision, she began anew the term of presidency, and therefore could be reelected for a second term. So there were a number of second terms until she had really solved, really, it was under Alda's first term, or second, I'm really not too sure. I think it was under her second term that she decided that not only should Italians serve on the Central Council, but some of the non-Italians who were present should also have an opportunity to be elected. And she told the assembly members this after her election. However, when the council members were elected, every one of them was an Italian. Alda was from southern Italy, and she really had what they call a testadura, a hard head, and she was very angry. So she said she would use one of her prerogatives as president and appoint someone who was not Italian to serve on the council without a vote, but with a voice. And I turned out to be the one. That was in 1958, and that I served on the council then for many years following that. At that assembly, one of the representatives, non-Italian representatives, was from England, and she was a very, very quiet person, very sedate, and she couldn't understand much Italian, nor could I. So we were just sitting there, and I will always remember Irene when she leaned over to me and said, in the midst of a tremendous hubbub, "They must be so disappointed in you and me." Irene did not remain with the Institute, and I think that was the Institute's loss. I don't think on the other tapes that I've talked very much about the spread of the Institute throughout the world. And since this was the period in which I lived and during which I served on the Central Council, I would like to say a little bit about it. First of all, I think we need to be very grateful to Father Stephen, because in all the classes which he taught at Holy Name College, he managed to bring in the existence of the Institute and to inform the young friars who were preparing for priesthood about the Institute, what it was, how it worked, who we were, and so on. And some of the spread of the Institute around the world came from some of these friars who were missioned in various countries. And when they met women who were interested in dedicating their lives in something other than what was then known as the Third Order of St. Francis, but not in a convent, these friars remembered what Father Stephen had taught them and wrote back to him and asked for information and written materials and so on, so they could look into it for the women in their own country. Thus, I think we need to remember always that Father Stephen did some of the greatest PR work for the Institute around the world. One of the early branches of the Institute came from the Philippines. Here the friar was Father Mel Brady, who still remains interested and active in assisting the Institute, but now back in the United States. There was one young Filipino woman who went to Father Mel and expressed her interest in the Institute. We provided the materials, and with Father Mel's assistance, she finally, in 1970, was ready for profession. So the Americans raised enough money and brought her over to the United States. She made her profession here in the USA, and then we had also had enough money that we could buy her a ticket to go over to Italy and meet the members of the Central Council as well as other missionaries over there, and so really become quite imbued with the Institute and with the Franciscan places in Italy, thus helping her to go back and begin with other Filipino young women, which she did. However, she had cancer, and while she was a young woman, she did not live very long, and very shortly handed over the reins of the Institute to the other young people coming in. I had the privilege of going over for the first profession of some of these first missionaries. It was a very interesting time. It was my first time in the Philippines, and Nancy went with me, but I do want to say to everyone that Nancy paid all her own expenses. She did not go at the expense of the Americans or at the expense of the Central Council. She was a very fine traveling companion, and I'm very glad that I had her with me. When the retreat was over and it was time for profession and the ceremonies, we made them in the residence of Cardinal Sin. He was, I don't believe he's still living, but he was a man of Chinese descent, looked very Chinese, but also had Filipino blood and had lived and worked and had been ordained in the Philippines. He was very interested in the Institute, was always good to the Institute, and he expressed it at this moment by allowing us to have our Mass of First Profession there, and then followed by a meal in his dining room. And it was, I've never been quite so hot in all my life, but it was a very beautiful occasion, and one which I thank God for many, many times. I've always felt that there was a close link between the Americans and the Filipinos, and so it was a great thing when some Filipino Americans asked for literature and began to pursue and discern their vocation. And I want to say that they have been very, very fine missionaries. There's a deep faith in the Philippines that I don't believe we quite understand here in this country. It's a beautiful faith, and one that inspires you as you work with them and live among them to do better and be on better terms with our Lord. The Institute in Brazil came to life through an American friar who had been one of Father Stephen's students and then was missioned in Brazil. He wrote and asked for information, and we sent it to him. Another American friar translated the Constitution and the rule into Portuguese. And when I went there for their very first retreat and began talking with them and sharing the vocation with them, this was during the period between Christmas and New Year's and just after New Year's, because that is summer for them, and they were on vacation and were very, very steeped in magnificent sunshine, but oh, was it hot, while we were embracing snow back here in the United States. One of the strange things I thought was hearing all our Christmas carols and seeing nothing but bright blue sky and sunshine and heat up into the hundreds. But they enjoyed singing the Christmas carols. This time Katie went with me, and once again at her own expense. She too was a great traveling companion, and we enjoyed being together. We stopped off first in Rio and saw a little bit of that city after we got off the plane, and then went on to Annapolis, where we met the priest and the women who were interested in being considered as for probanship within the Institute. One of the interesting things was that one of the women was a little older, and everyone was very, very frank, but we never thought to question, was she a widow or was she not? Well, when they finally sent applications over to Rome for us to look at, no one there really spoke Portuguese, and so the fact that she had put down on her application that she was a widow we missed it completely, and she was accepted as a proban. Actually, she then went on to profession, and until her death was a very fine addition to the Institute. The Institute in Brazil spread rather rapidly. It's a tremendous country, a very poor country, and the distance between one spot and another reminds you of many of the distances here in the United States. The people there also have a very beautiful faith, and they were a very, very good, interested probans and aspirants, and it was a great joy to see them reach profession and then to increase and continue increasing. One of the things that happened to them, and I think this is very, very impressive, they felt, as we had felt some years before, that we needed a common place where we could gather all these young women from the many different parts of the country. And so, with the help of one of the groups in Italy, that is financial help, they were able to build the Villa Armida Borelli, and they use that now today as their center and as a retreat and conference center in Italy. They also have had one member on the Central Council, and so that as a little product of the United States, they are a little plant that is growing beautifully. in its own way, the Japanese Institute began in conjunction with the American Institute. There, the friar there was a Canadian friar, a mission to Japan, and he came back to Canada one time on leave and was talking to some of the Canadian missionaries who were really just getting going, and they were under the direction of an Italian missionary who had been sent over to see that the Institute got off on the right foot. Well, they came down to the United States to visit with us, and we were still living at that time in my house on, not on Cedar Lane, I forget the name of the place, to tell you the truth. This was before we moved to Cedar Lane. But there, the priest began to talk again about the Institute, and he at first wanted the first missionaries who were interested, or the first Japanese who were interested, to come and live with us for a year. But I was not in favor of that, because I thought they should go through their years of probanship and aspirancy in their own environment. Fortunately for me, when he went to Italy and talked with Father Gemelli agreed, and so they began the Institute using our materials, because his name at that time was Father Telesphore, and he could read English and translate for them. Some years later, I was asked to go to visit them, and that was a very, very beautiful experience. I did not know very much about Japan, except that we had been on opposite sides during World War II. But I became very impressed with the women there, and their sincerity, their desire to please the Lord, their desire to live good missionary lives. And I think we have to point out that in the Far East, most missionaries begin their lives as pagans. Then they are converted to Catholicism, and then from then on, they work up into asking permission to enter the Institute. And so that one of the outcroppings of all that is that many of them are still living at home with pagan parents, and it presents a problem because they do not wish to marry, and this the pagan parents cannot quite understand. I stayed at that time, at the time of my visit, with one of the Japanese missionaries, and I was told that the reason I was staying with her was because she had some Western facilities. We slept in beds. She had a Western bathroom, and that certainly made life very much easier for me. Several interesting things happened during that trip. The foundress of the Institute in Japan was the sister of one of the men who had lived, I'm not sure now whether it was in Nagasaki or Hiroshima, and was there at the time we dropped the atom bomb. His wife was killed instantly. He was a doctor, a very well-educated man, very intelligent, and he wrote a most interesting little book. I happen to have a copy of it, telling of the effects of the radiation on him, and really chronicling his own minutes, hours, and days before he too died. His wife was found with the rosary in her hand after her death. That to me was a very beautiful thing. The Unizuka was studying medicine. She had been married. She had a little son. During the war, the son and husband and herself all went on one of these long prison walks in Japan, and the son and husband died. She did not, and she did suffer some from the radiation and as we dropped the bombs in the two large cities. She was an excellent guide in helping me to understand Japanese culture and to show me many of the great spots in Japan. The first night I was there, I was asked if I liked chicken, and I said yes, I did. Well, she whispered something to one of the missionaries, and the missionary disappeared and came back with some Kentucky fried chicken. That really wasn't what I expected for my first meal in Japan, but it was very good. Some days later, I went to visit an American friar who lived there and worked there, and he had a TV program. So I went to visit him after Mass one Sunday, and his secretary was a missionary. At the present time, she is the group leader there. At least she's the group leader of the Tokyo group. There is another group now forming in Japan. And he said something to her that morning when he said to me, "You will stay and have lunch with us." Well, and I said yes. This time she went out, got something, came back, and it turned out to be a McDonald's hamburger and a milkshake. So you see, in many ways, they had taken on to our culture in the early years, really, of the Institute. In New Zealand, there was an Italian missionary who had moved there a number of years before this with her family. She had been a teacher, and her English was really very good, and she assimilated the culture of New Zealand to an admirable extent. At the time that I met her, she was no longer teaching because she was at home taking care of both of her mother and father, both of whom were seriously ill. I met her in 1970, and she said then that she thought it would be good for someone to come to Australia and also to New Zealand and to talk with some of the hierarchy there and to see if we could not get a toehold for the Institute. So I was asked by the Central Council to go in the late 70s. I went for the very first time. This time Connie went with me, and we visited basically the bishops in the various dioceses and the various states of Australia, and then down into New Zealand. I went back again, and at this time, Betts, who had been living and teaching in Afghanistan, had been forced to leave Afghanistan because of the war situation there, and she had gone first into Pakistan and then was able to get a visa and go into Italy. Into Australia. And she was very interested in helping to establish the Institute in Australia. So with some free time and so on, she went in visiting in the various parishes, particularly in Melbourne and Sydney, and then spread out by way of the written word, even as far west as Perth, on the opposite end of the continent, looking out onto the Indian Ocean. I was asked to follow up when there were some applications, and this I did, and this was the second of 10 trips that I made to Australia before I felt that it was time that a newcomer, a younger person, take over and work with the Institute in Australia. Each country seems to start with a bit of a problem. In Australia, there were two missionaries, Italian missionaries, who had immigrated there with their families many years before, but had remained true to their missionary vocation, even though they were living alone on a new continent, learning a new language, learning a new way of life, new work habits, and so on. And I first made contact with them actually during my first visit there, and this was a rather easy contact because one of the friars from the Melbourne, Sydney areas was living and working in very close to Bethesda, Maryland, in the Archdiocese of Washington. And so I had come to know him, and he again supplied me with addresses and so on, so that I began to learn my way around Australia. The two missionaries who had made their profession in Italy and so on were very concerned about having Australians come into the Institute, simply because they, in those days, had been treated as immigrants in many countries were treated, and they did not believe that there could be a good feeling, a good spirit, and particularly a spirit of unity if and when Australians were admitted to the Institute. However, it worked out very, very nicely, and we still have Australians. The present group leader is an Australian. Our previous group leader is an East Indian who had immigrated to Australia, and so that they are becoming almost as cosmopolitan in one sense as the Americans have become. I felt a very close kinship to the Australians, perhaps because we could speak basically the same language, and it was very easy to communicate with them. I always stayed, when I was in Melbourne, with Franca Tomaselli, one of the Italian missionaries, a very lovely woman. She cared for her mother after her father died, and her mother lived to be 100 years old. Very fine woman. I enjoyed staying with them. We had many happy times together. I remember one thing that I found very interesting. I was asked one night what I would like to have for dinner. And I said, oh, I'd love to have a lamb chop. And she looked at me and she said, Barbara, we never serve lamb chops to guests. She said, only family eats them. And I said, well, then consider me family so I can have a lamb chop. Well, she took me to the grocery store, and lamb chops were only 25 cents a piece there. So you see, they do have, in some places, more sheep than people. When I was visiting the bishops on my very first visit, the Cardinal of Sydney was out of the country, and he had me referred to one of his auxiliaries. This auxiliary bishop was on head of the seminary, and we had really good talks. Well, he was coming to the United States to visit seminaries, and of course their summer vacation corresponded to our winter, and therefore included Christmas and New Year's and all those great holidays. And one day I received a phone call at the villa, and it was from his secretary saying that he would arrive at Dulles Airport at such and such a time, and could I meet him? I said, yes, I would be happy to meet him. Well, he came. I met him. He came and stayed at the villa. He spent Christmas with us. He spent New Year's with us, and he stayed for a month.